Before the Sackler family made billions by addicting Americans to opioids, another dynasty perfected the exact same model by forcing an entire nation into drug dependency for profit. The Jardine dynasty didn't just push drugs. They waged wars to keep their customers addicted, controlled governments to protect their supply chains, and built a financial empire that still shapes global banking today. Between 1839 and 1949, this single-family operation killed more people through forced addiction than every American drug epidemic combined. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The trading ledgers exist, the military dispatches survive, and the bank records are public. What they built in China became the template for how modern pharmaceutical companies operate today. And once you see the mechanism, you'll recognize it everywhere. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what the opium trade actually was. This wasn't black market drug dealing. This was a vertically integrated corporate operation that controlled production in British India, shipping across the Pacific, distribution networks throughout China, and the military force to protect market access. The British East India Company grew opium in Bengal and Bihar, then licensed private traders like Jardine Matheson to handle the smuggling and sales. The Chinese government banned opium imports in 1729, but the British response was to increase production and deploy warships to keep the drugs flowing. By 1838, China was importing over 40,000 chests of opium annually, with each chest containing about 140 pounds of pure narcotic. That's 8 million pounds of addictive drugs pumped into a single nation every year by corporate decision. Let's look at how William Jardine and James Matheson built their empire. Jardine arrived in Canton in 1802 as a ship's surgeon for the East India Company, but quickly realized the money was in independent trading. Matheson joined him in 1827, and together they established Jardine, Matheson and Company with a simple business model: buy opium from British India at wholesale prices around 400 rupees per chest, smuggle it into China, and sell it for $700 to $900 per chest in silver. The profit margins were enormous because addiction created guaranteed repeat customers. Jardine kept meticulous records of his Chinese clients' purchasing patterns, tracking which regions showed increased dependency and adjusting supply accordingly. The company's internal documents from 1838 show they were deliberately targeting areas with the highest addiction rates because, as Jardine wrote to his partner, the more they need it, the more they'll pay for it. This wasn't opportunistic drug dealing. This was scientific market manipulation using chemical dependency. The Chinese government understood exactly what was happening. Emperor Daoguang appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner in 1838, with explicit orders to end the opium trade. Lin Zexu wrote directly to Queen Victoria in 1839, asking how Britain could justify selling drugs that were illegal in England to Chinese citizens. His letter stated clearly, "Your country prohibits opium. This is because the harm it causes is understood. Since it is not permitted to harm your own country, then even less should you allow it to be passed on to harm other countries." The British response was to increase opium shipments and position naval forces in Chinese waters. When Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed 20 Zhuozheran chests of opium worth $6 million in March 1839, Jardine personally travelled to London to lobby Parliament for military intervention. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, the parliamentary debates are public record. Jardine spent $50 zeros of company money convincing British politicians that protecting drug dealers was a matter of national honour. The First Opium War began in 1839 because Jardine needed military protection for his business model. The British deployed 16 warships and 4 000 troops not to defend legitimate commerce, but to force China to accept drug imports. Captain Charles Elliot, The British Superintendent of Trade received direct instructions from Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston that Britain would use such measures of coercion as necessary to ensure compensation for the destroyed opium and security for future trade. The war lasted 2 years and killed over 20,000 Chinese civilians, but the real victory was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, including 6 million specifically for the opium Jardine had lost. More importantly, the treaty legalized opium imports under the euphemism of general trade and opened 5 Chinese ports to British merchants. Jardine had successfully weaponized his own government to protect his drug operation. But the Jardine dynasty's masterstroke was what happened after the war. James Matheson used the war profits to purchase the entire Scottish island of Lewis for $190,000 in 1844, while William Jardine's nephew David became the first elected Member of Parliament for Ashburton in 1841. The family had parlayed drug profits into political power and landed aristocracy in a single generation. More crucially, they established the template for how modern corporations capture regulatory systems. The Jardines didn't just sell drugs, they became the regulatory framework that permitted drug sales. David Jardine voted on every piece of China trade legislation between 1841 and 1865, personally ensuring that opium remained legal and profitable. When the Chinese government attempted to renegotiate trade terms in 1856, Jardine Matheson lobbied for the Second Opium War, which lasted from 1856 to 1860 and resulted in the Treaty of Tientsin that fully legalized opium throughout China. The pattern is clear: create addiction, defend it with violence, capture the regulators, expand the market. The financial architecture the Jardines built still shapes global banking today. Jardine Matheson established the first Western banks in Hong Kong and Shanghai specifically to process opium profits. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, founded in 1865, was created to handle the silver flows from Chinese drug purchases to British merchants. HSBC's founding shareholders included every major opium trader in Asia, with Jardine Matheson holding the largest stake. The bank's internal documents from 1866 show that over 60% of deposits came directly from opium profits, which were then invested in railway construction, shipping lines, and real estate development throughout Asia. This wasn't money laundering in the modern sense, because the drug trade was legal. This was the systematic conversion of addiction profits into permanent financial infrastructure. HSBC became Europe's window into Asian markets, and those markets were built on forced drug consumption. The scale of what the Jardines accomplished is staggering. Between 1842 and 1880, Chinese opium consumption increased from 40 Suzerain chests annually to over 100 Suzerain chests. Conservative estimates suggest that 12 million Chinese citizens were addicted to opium by 1880, representing roughly 3% of the total population. The Jardine family personally controlled about 30% of this trade, making them responsible for addicting approximately 6 million people. The economic impact was equally devastating. China spent an estimated 100 million silver taels annually on opium imports between 1850 and 1880, representing roughly 15% of the entire Chinese economy flowing out of the country to pay for drugs. The silver drain was so severe that China couldn't maintain its currency stability, leading to inflation, rural poverty, and the collapse of traditional industries. The Taiping Rebellion, which killed over 20 million people between 1850 and 1864, was directly triggered by economic chaos caused by opium-induced silver shortages. The Jardines didn't just profit from addiction, they destabilized an entire civilization for generational wealth. Let me show you the six-stage sequence that the Jardine dynasty perfected, because this exact pattern repeats across industries and centuries. Stage 1. Identify a product that creates physical dependency. The Jardines recognized that opium addiction was involuntary once established, creating a customer base that couldn't choose to stop purchasing regardless of price or quality. Stage 2. Establish exclusive supply control. By partnering with the British East India Company, they controlled opium production from seed to shipping, ensuring no competitors could undercut their prices or supply. Stage 3. Penetrate markets despite local resistance. When Chinese authorities banned opium, the Jardines used bribery, smuggling, and ultimately military force to maintain market access. Stage 4. Capture regulatory systems. Once they had profits, they bought political influence in Britain to ensure government policy protected their business model. Stage 5. Expand the dependency base. With regulatory protection secured, they systematically increase supply to create new addicts and deepen existing addictions. Stage 6. Convert temporary profits into permanent institutional power. The Jardines used drug money to purchase land, political offices, and banking systems that generated wealth long after the original opium trade ended. Now let's check where we are today with pharmaceutical companies and opioid addiction. Stage 1. Identify dependency products. Check. OxyContin was specifically designed to create physical addiction within days of first use, exactly like opium. Stage 2. Establish supply control. Check. Purdue Pharma controlled both the patent and manufacturing, preventing generic competition for years. Stage 3. Penetrate resistant markets. Check. When doctors hesitated to prescribe addictive painkillers, Purdue deployed sales representatives to pressure physicians and funded medical conferences to change prescribing guidelines. Stage 4. Capture regulatory systems. Check. Purdue spent millions lobbying the FDA and placing former executives in regulatory positions that approved expanded OxyContin usage. Stage 5. Expand dependency. Check. Between 1999 and 2019, over 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses, representing the successful creation of a mass addiction market. Stage 6. Convert profits to permanent power. Check. The Sackler family used opioid profits to purchase art collections, museum naming rights, and university endowments that cement their social status regardless of criminal liability. The Jardine model works because addiction eliminates customer choice, and eliminating choice eliminates market forces. The pattern within the pattern is how these dynasties weaponize moral authority to protect immoral business models. The Jardines claimed they were bringing free trade to Asia and civilizing Chinese markets through exposure to Western commerce. Their political allies in Parliament argued that forcing China to accept opium was defending the principle that nations couldn't unilaterally ban foreign products. The moral framework was commercial freedom, not drug dealing. Similarly, the Sacklers claimed they were revolutionizing pain management and helping doctors treat patient suffering more effectively. Their medical allies argued that restricting opioid prescriptions was condemning patients to unnecessary pain. The moral framework was compassionate healthcare, not addiction creation. In both cases, the ethical cover story prevented regulators and the public from recognizing the underlying extraction mechanism until millions were already addicted. This is why these operations succeed. They hide inside legitimate-sounding moral crusades that make opposition seem heartless or economically ignorant. The financial engineering is identical across centuries. The Jardines established banks and shipping companies that processed opium profits but appeared to be legitimate international commerce. HSBC still exists today as a major global bank, and most customers have no idea it was founded to launder drug money. The Sacklers use similar techniques, routing OxyContin profits through family trusts, art foundations, and overseas accounts that appeared to be philanthropic or investment activities. Both dynasties understood that temporary drug profits had to be converted into permanent institutional power that would survive regulatory changes or public backlash. They didn't just want to be rich, they wanted to be untouchable. And in both cases, they largely succeeded. The Jardine family still owns vast estates in Scotland, still sits in the House of Lords, and Jardine Matheson still operates as a major Asian conglomerate. The Sacklers may pay billions in fines, but they retain their art collections, their museum wings, and their university endowments. Here's why this matters right now. The six-stage sequence isn't historical curiosity. It's the active playbook for how modern corporations create extraction systems that survive regulatory oversight. Technology companies are using the exact same model with social media addiction, creating products designed to maximize user engagement regardless of psychological harm, then capturing regulatory systems to prevent meaningful oversight. Food companies have perfected the chemistry of processed foods to create eating patterns that mirror addiction, then lobby against labeling requirements that would inform consumer choice. Cryptocurrency exchanges are deliberately targeting young investors with gambling-style interfaces that create compulsive trading behaviors, then positioning themselves as financial innovation rather than predatory speculation. The fundamental mechanism never changes. Identify a human vulnerability, exploit it systematically, capture the regulators who might stop you, expand the exploitation, and convert short-term extraction into permanent institutional power. If this pattern continues, we're looking at the systematic conversion of every human biological and psychological vulnerability into corporate profit streams protected by captured regulatory systems. The Jardines proved that addiction-based business models can operate openly for decades if they're backed by sufficient political power and wrapped in moral authority. The Sacklers proved that the same model works in modern democratic societies with supposedly independent regulatory agencies. The technology, food, and financial companies currently deploying these techniques will prove that the model scales infinitely as long as societies prioritize corporate profits over human welfare. We're not looking at isolated business scandals. We're looking at the emergence of an economic system based on the systematic exploitation of human biological and psychological dependencies. The trajectory is clear and the timeline is accelerating. Within 10 years, if current trends continue, most American economic activity will center on addiction-based revenue models protected by regulatory capture. Social media companies will perfect behavioral addiction techniques that make current platforms look primitive. Food companies will develop processed products that create biological dependencies indistinguishable from chemical addiction. Financial companies will create investment products designed to trigger compulsive trading behaviors that guarantee customer losses and corporate profits. Healthcare companies will expand the Sackler model to new categories of medications and treatments. Each industry will claim moral authority through innovation, patient care, consumer choice, or financial inclusion, while the underlying mechanism remains identical. Identify dependency, exploit dependency, protect exploitation through political capture, expand exploitation, convert profits to permanent power. The only question is whether American society will recognize the pattern before it becomes irreversible. The Jardines operated for over a century because Chinese society couldn't muster sufficient political will to expel them permanently. The Sacklers operated for decades because American society prioritized pharmaceutical innovation over addiction prevention. The next wave of extraction dynasties will operate indefinitely unless American citizens demand that regulatory systems serve human welfare rather than corporate profits. This requires understanding that addiction-based business models are not aberrations or scandals. They are systematic wealth extraction mechanisms that require systematic political responses. Subscribe to this channel because they're not going to teach you this pattern recognition in business school. And when the next addiction dynasty emerges, you'll want to recognize the 6-stage sequence before you become the customer base they're targeting.